Welcome to A New Capitalism, the podcast that will show you how you can invest your money to help create a more just and prosperous economy for all. Here's Frank Altman.
My guest this week is Kimberlee Cornett, the Senior Director of Impact Investments at the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. Kimberlee has pioneered innovative financing models like pay for performance to fund critical services and affordable housing. A passionate community leader, she serves on the boards of Habitat for Humanity International and the Conservation Fund. Kimberlee, thank you for joining the podcast.
Thank you, Frank. It's nice to see you.
So I appreciate your willingness to join and talk a little bit about what I think is very exciting developments in impact finance, and that's the use of endowments and assets in new and creative ways in impact investment. So could you talk just a little bit before we jump into the details about how you came to be involved in social impact investing, a little bit about your background and career?
I started my career working at a homeless shelter, actually down the road in Washington, D.C. In an unexpected move, a group of volunteers was organizing a new Habitat for Humanity affiliate across the river in Virginia. I had been involved with Habitat forever in college and in high school. And so I joined them to begin that new organization and loved that work for a few years before I left for a White House fellowship. And I expected to go back to Habitat after my time at the White House, but really kind of became enamored as the CDFI fund was really kind of coming into its own, the low-income housing tax credit. And so I became really interested in how to use capital markets to effectuate social change. And I was really fortunate to meet Bart Harvey, who was the longtime chairman of the Enterprise Foundation, which is what it was called back then. And so kind of went back to school, if you will, learning the mechanics of the low-income housing tax credit, and ended up in that business for about a decade. And much to my surprise, the training that I really received in that kind of core housing program really has followed me through my career and was really foundational in many of the skills that I still use today.
And the Enterprise Foundation and its subsidiaries have been really a major pioneer in this whole field. And it sounds like Bart Harvey was a mentor for you during those formative years.
For me and for many people, those were really the glory days. I worked with an incredible team of people, Carrie Downs, including, who has just taken over Enterprise Community Credit, Vicki Vaughn and Dan Mendelson, who were big mentors of mine. And we were really all still learning the business. The tax credit hadn't even kind of aged its first deals at year 15. I mean, that seemed like a milestone that was forever away. And now transactions that I worked on, have well surpassed that. So it was really a terrific training ground. I feel really fortunate. And many of my colleagues have gone on to do other really interesting things. Stockton Williams, who I worked closely with, is now running the National Council of State Housing Finance Agencies. So it's been great to see where those seeds have planted.
Yeah, I've known Stockton for many years as well. I want to really just pivot a little bit to where we first began working together, and that is when you joined the board of what is now U.S. SIF, and later the role that you took on at the Kresge Foundation. In my book, I talk at length about the Detroit Home Mortgage and the innovation that the Detroit Home Mortgage Initiative had to jumpstart the moribund housing market in Detroit after the crash of 2008. And what was really amazing to me about that whole process was it was a government, public-private, nonprofit effort, spearheaded by the mayor, spearheaded by Rip Rapson, your president at the Kresge Foundation, and others. But could you talk a little bit about the role that Kresge played in making this all happen?
So maybe to back the tape up just a bit. So in 2008, when I was still at Enterprise, the tax credit market was, really suffering as many industries were. And I got a call about a foundation in the Midwest, looking to start to use impact investments. I didn't know a whole lot about that, but it seemed like a good time for a change. And so my family and I ended up moving to Detroit. And again, feel really lucky to have had that experience. I mean, Detroit was hanging on really by its fingernails at that point. And, having come from the investment market, I really didn't have an appreciation for really the critical and catalytic role that grant making can play in helping to create the conditions that make it possible for people to invest. And, a big shout out to Rip and to my colleague, Wendy Jackson, who I think did some just exemplary work that will go down in history in terms of really trying to use grants, sometimes very small grants, to really create stability, again, where capital can come in. And that work really, laid the foundation, if you will, for Detroit Home Mortgage. And, it was interesting because you don't think about things like the lack of appraisals necessarily as, a problem that philanthropy should really take on. But it was such a problem in the market. And it really did take the leadership of the foundation and its capital to really create the table and the conditions by which that consortium of folks that you just referenced really came together to innovate around this solution. So I feel really fortunate to have been steering the team at that point. My colleague, Kim Dempsey, and later our colleague, Aaron Seibert, were really the folks who really drove that program. But I do think it's a tremendous example of, strategic philanthropy really at its best.
So just for people listening to this podcast who may not know the details, just briefly, after 2008, when the market really collapsed, particularly the housing market, the city of Detroit, a city of more than 700,000 residents, there were less than 400 mortgages made that year following the crash. And one of the big problems that was causing the lack of financing was that appraisers could not find comparable appraisals, comparable transactions to use in their appraisals that were anywhere near the price that a willing buyer and a willing seller were willing to make a deal on. And so somebody might want to buy a house for $25,000 or $30,000, which was not uncommon back at that period of time, fix it up and live in it. But the appraisal would come back and say the house is worth $5,000 or it's worth $2,000. And so nobody could come up with that kind of down payment. So these deals fell apart. And the role that was played by the banks in Detroit, and we had about 5 banks that agreed to make these mortgages and create a mortgage that would allow somebody to cover the appraisal gap with a second lien guaranteed by the Kresge Foundation. So it took the risk out and allowed these banks to make conforming mortgages and get the mortgage market started. And at the end of the program, which I think was about 5 years, we were back to pre-crash volume of mortgages in Detroit, and banks being able to make mortgages with their own products as the mortgage market now is primed and was moving forward. So I just wanted our listeners to understand how incredibly innovative that was, and how exactly what you're saying, Kimberlee, the catalytic role that the foundation played with all of its tools, including the resources it had at its disposal on its balance sheet from the endowment.
And I mean, Frank, as you will know, a whole constellation of banks, right? I mean, everybody was pulling. I do think that the foundation, again, helped to create the conditions. But, even though, what Detroit and other cities went through was very difficult, I continue to be amazed at how it also created the ripeness for true innovation for everybody rolling up their sleeves, almost, regardless of the sector that you sat in. So it was a special time to be in Detroit.
It was. And it was a special time in my perspective, from my perspective, because as you know, the title of my book is The New Capitalism, Creating a Just Economy That Works for All. And this was a capitalist approach. These were banks making these loans. These were not nonprofits. They were banks who were enabled to be able to make conforming mortgages subject to the regulations that Congress had imposed on mortgages after the 2008 crash, and get those mortgages back into the hands of people who wanted to buy a house, to own a home in Detroit, and to fix up their home. So it was an amazing time from my perspective as well. And just to follow up on that a little bit, shortly after we worked together on the Detroit home mortgage, Kresge, under your leadership and Rip's leadership, created a new approach, the Community Investment Guarantee Program, for a consortium of foundations. Could you talk a little bit about that and how that's working?
So CIGP was built really to accomplish three things. One, to make it more efficient for organizations like CDFIs, development finance agencies, others, to find the resources that they need through one door. The second was to really demonstrate to the market how multi-investor structures, sharing of risk, again, can be efficient for the investor collaborative. And three, to make the programmatic screen of what qualifies really at the sectoral level. So CIGP makes guarantees in three sectors: housing, small business, and climate. All of those underlying transactions must be for the benefit of low and moderate income communities. But beyond that, there's no additional screen. So we were really trying to kind of take the way that really the financial markets work, which is around intermediation and shared risk, and bring that over to the community investment system, and make a new piece of infrastructure that could benefit many and be financially and operationally sustainable over time. And almost 4 years in, I'm pleased to say that we've achieved those things. CIGP won a really important grant from philanthropist Mackenzie Scott last year, which really improved its solvency. And we think that we have created a new piece of infrastructure which is going to grow and evolve over time to meet other needs in the system.
So in the book, we do talk about this sort of spectrum of socially motivated investments, or what some people call impact first investments, and then market rate investments. And right in the middle of that spectrum is guarantees, both market rate guarantees and subsidized guarantees, or below market, oftentimes provided by foundations or through the consortium we just described. So could you talk a little bit about the light bulbs that's going on at many foundations about the fact that they really have never leveraged their endowments, and that's where the capital is in many of these organizations? Talk a little bit about the theory behind these guarantee structures.
Well, I can say the way that I think about it is that foundations really have a continuum of capital. They have their grant making, many now have impact investing, and then you have our market rate investments. And each of those pieces of capital has an important role to play in the business of creating liquidity and investment that goes back into communities. At RWJ, we have a $625 million allocation on the impact investing side that makes debt and equity investments and guarantees. Out of our endowment, we have several, I think, really very powerful and kind of leaning forward initiatives around diverse managers. We have some screens that we apply very rigorously around kind of health impacts, specifically firearms, alcohol, tobacco, cannabis. And we're very thoughtful about thinking through the implications of our investment. We're also a signatory on the Human Rights Investor Council. So what I can say is that, the most precious resource that we have is the grants, which are, created from the liquidity that the endowment earns. And by making guarantees, I have always found that to be a way for us to thread the needle. We can catalyze investment out in the field today without requiring current liquidity from the endowment, so that the endowment continues to do what it does best, which is generate income that we can then use for grants. And there is a natural tension that exists between those activities. But at RWJ, I think increasingly we're really trying to see this as a continuum. And one of the things that I really enjoy is kind of being the bridge, between those worlds.
So tell us a little bit more about RWJF and the work that it does for those who are not familiar with it.
Yeah, so the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation is based in Princeton, New Jersey. We are celebrating our 50th year next year. The foundation is a $14 billion philanthropy focused exclusively on health and health equity. I came to the foundation just a week or so before the pandemic. And even during my short tenure, the foundation has really evolved. And so, historically, I think what people would know RWJ for is really, its funding and expertise, really in matters of health and well-being. And that continues to be true. I think the evolution that has happened is that after the murder of George Floyd, I think the foundation really took a very hard look at the role of racism and racist policies as a driver of health outcomes. And the truth is that health outcomes for families of color and white individuals are different. And some of those are a result of policies and disinvestment that has happened over generations. So the foundation has, pivoted to really think more exclusively and concretely around the role of its capital, all forms of the capital, as it relates to communities of color, and not just communities of color, but also other very disenfranchised communities, rural communities. Actually, over half of our impact investing portfolio is invested in rural communities, and we're really pleased about that. Big concentration on tribal nations, and really thinking about how we can make our capital go the last mile. We have a long way to go to perfect how we do that in a way that is fully equitable and makes it as easy as possible for those seeking capital. But we're really thinking very differently about trying to figure out what is it going to take in terms of both capital, technical assistance, and other support, again, to make the capital go to places where it just doesn't naturally want to go.
Thanks for sharing that. And I want to dig into your work at the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, but we have to stop here. Coming up next on A New Capitalism, Kimberlee Cornett will talk about the importance of innovation in impact investing.
Sometimes the first iteration, like the first batch of cookies that you make, they look kind of ugly. But over time, people, when we work together, when we really leverage the resources of field practitioners like yourself and CRF and philanthropy and community members, ultimately we really create something that is real value add for communities.
This has been A New Capitalism with Frank Altman. If you'd like to connect with Frank and join the movement to create a new capitalism that works for all, go to frankaltman.com. Frank's book is available on print, audio, and ebook formats on all major book-selling sites. A New Capitalism is a production of Forbes Books.